Okay, let's just jump right into it. Picture this. It is August 26, 1346, just south of Calais in northern France. You're standing ankle-deep in mud, surrounded by the absolute deafening chaos of the Battle of Crécy. The English right flank is completely surrounded. They are taking the furious, devastating brunt of a massive French assault. Thrown to the ground, severely concussed, and fighting desperately for his very life against seemingly impossible odds is a commander rallying his troops. But here is the crazy catch. That commander? He's a 16-year-old boy. That boy is Prince Edward, and today's explainer is all about the man who would forge a legendary and, frankly, terrifying reputation across medieval Europe. It's a fascinating question to think about, isn't it? Who was the greatest king England never had? That idea perfectly sets up our journey today. We're going to explore the incredible rise, the highly controversial military tactics, and the incredibly tragic, anticlimactic fall of Edward, the Black Prince. He was the guy who literally defined an era of medieval chivalry, and yet his methods were utterly ruthless.
Section 1. Forged in battle at Crécy. To put the sheer scale of the danger he faced into perspective, you have to look at the disparity in numbers. It was staggering. The English army, led by King Edward III, had roughly 9,500 to 11,500 men. The French force approaching them? Over 20,000. The young prince was given command of the right wing, which basically meant that when the main French force finally hit in the early evening, this 16-year-old was staring down the barrel of an overwhelming, vastly superior enemy cavalry. The peril he was in literally cannot be overstated.
But even after being beaten to the ground and badly concussed, you know what? He didn't break. He picked himself right back up, rallied his forces, and fought so valiantly that the English didn't just hold the line, they completely routed the French. Get this, the English sustained fewer than 300 casualties. As father and son surveyed the battlefield the next day, they found the body of the blind King John of Bohemia, who was one of the era's greatest warriors. Deeply moved by this, the young prince claimed the fallen king's emblem of 3 white feathers, and amazingly, that's a symbol still used by the Prince of Wales to this very day.
Moving on to Section 2. Origins of the Black Prince.
So he was born in 1330 at Woodstock Palace to King Edward III in Queen Philippa, making him the heir to a kingdom desperately trying to reclaim its lost glory. But to really understand the man behind the myth, we need to talk about that famous nickname. Actually, scratch that. The Black Prince was a name that was never even used during his actual lifetime. Seriously, it was a Tudor-era invention, coined over a century later. So why black? Well, historians float 3 main theories. Theory 1, he supposedly wore black armor into battle. Theory 2, it came from his incredibly dark reputation for brutal, scorched-earth warfare. And Theory 3, the most straightforward one, his coat of arms simply featured a black background behind those 3 white ostrich feathers.
Now, speaking of that dark reputation, we have to talk about his tactics. Specifically, a really vital military concept of the era called the chevauchée. Look, this wasn't about glorious, honorable open-field battles. This was a brutal, plundering raid. The strategy is simple. You burn the land, you steal the resources, and you absolutely devastate the enemy's economy and their capacity to wage war. In 1355, the prince led this massive, devastating 250-mile march from Bordeaux all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. He just left an unprecedented trail of ashes in his wake.
All right, Section 3, the triumph at Poitiers.
Fast forward to 1356. Talk about a desperate situation. On one side, you have the Black Prince's army, about 7,000 completely exhausted men, their retreat cut off by swollen rivers, just desperately trying to get back to friendly territory. And on the other side, the newly crowned French King John II has rallied over 20,000 men to crush the English threat once and for all. The prince's forces are trapped, they are massively outnumbered, and the French have completely cut across their line of march. It looks like game over.
But here is where his absolute tactical genius shines. In 4 sweeping moves, he snatches total victory right from the jaws of certain defeat. Step 1. He uses his baggage carts to fake a retreat, drawing the heavily armored French cavalry into a premature charge. Step 2. His legendary longbowmen shift to the flanks and target the unarmored rears of the French horses. Absolute devastation. Step 3. As the French infantry slogs forward exhausted, the prince launches a surprise cavalry charge straight into their center. And finally, Step 4. He sends his Gascon reserves swinging all the way around to crash into the French left flank. Bam! The French army simply shatters.
And the ultimate prize for that brilliant tactical masterclass, 4 million. Let that sink in, 4 million French crowns. That was the staggering ransom demanded for King John II, who was personally captured on the battlefield. I mean, this was the absolute pinnacle of the Black Prince's career. He was the undisputed master of European warfare, literally parading a captive king through the streets of London.
Now, you might be wondering what he did with all that wealth. Well, with that fame came a reputation for incredible, almost bankrupting extravagance. But here's the thing. It was extravagance with a purpose. In the medieval world, especially right after the Black Death, which caused massive labor shortages, soldiers and lords had serious negotiating power. The prince couldn't just demand loyalty anymore. He had to buy it. Lavish feasting, grand gifts, blowing unbelievable amounts of money. These were vital political tools. It was absolutely necessary to maintain the allegiance of his men and the nobles in his lands.
Which brings us to Section 4, War in Spain and Sickness.
It is honestly shocking how fast the whole thing just unravels. In early 1367, he wins this stunning tactical victory at Nájera to restore King Pedro of Castile. But then, Pedro doesn't pay his massive debts, so the prince is suddenly on the verge of bankruptcy. By August of that year, a terrible outbreak of dysentery strikes his unpaid army, and the prince himself falls gravely ill. Desperate to cover his debts, he heavily taxes his subjects in Aquitaine in 1368, which immediately sparks widespread rebellion. By 1370, sick and bedridden, he leads the brutal siege of Limoges, and finally, in 1376, he dies. It's a complete collapse in less than a decade.
The true tragedy of this decline hits especially hard through a modern lens. Think about it. The greatest warrior of medieval Europe, a man who survived the bloody, chaotic melees of Crécy and Poitiers without a single scratch, was slowly destroyed by dysentery, an illness that today we'd easily cure with a basic round of antibiotics. This simple bacterial infection just completely drained him of his legendary energy, his charm, and ultimately his power.
And finally, Section 5, the legacy of chivalry.
So, we have to talk about Limoges because it's one of the biggest stains on his legacy. During his final siege there, he was so weak he actually had to be carried on a litter. For centuries, the myth, heavily pushed by the chronicler Jean Froissart, was that the prince indiscriminately slaughtered 3,000 civilians in this blood-crazed frenzy. But the historical fact, records show casualties were actually limited to around 300. It was undoubtedly brutal, as literally all medieval sieges were, but that infamous massacre story that totally defined his dark reputation in France, largely fabricated propaganda.
The end finally arrived on June 8, 1376. The prince died at the age of just 45, likely from the lingering effects of that same bout of dysentery. He never became king. Instead, his elderly father actually outlived him by a year, meaning the throne skipped him entirely and passed to the Black Prince's 10-year-old son, Richard II. And Richard's incredibly divisive and turbulent reign would eventually spark the devastating Wars of the Roses.
His life just perfectly captures the supreme duality of medieval warfare. I mean, his personal surgeon called him the very flower of chivalry. This was a commander who heavily utilized the chevauchée to burn civilian farmlands to ashes, yet simultaneously he was revered by both his closest allies and his bitterest enemies as the absolute perfect embodiment of honor, generosity, and courage. He lived and died by a code that the entire medieval world aspired to.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative question. Was Edward the Black Prince a heroic knight defending his family's claims with brilliant tactical maneuvering, or was he a ruthless conqueror who brought devastating fire and ruin to the people of France? The answer, like so much of history, probably sits somewhere in the murky middle. I really hope this explainer has given you the context to decide for yourself, and maybe sparked your curiosity to learn even more about this fascinating era. Thanks for joining me, and keep exploring.